welcome to The Aggressive Life. We've got over 100 episodes of this podcast, a lot of conversations, lots of aggressive moves. And I don't know why you come to this show, but my hope is that at least some of you come looking for some encouragement, some guidance, some wisdom to push your life forward. Well, guess what? I also need that. I am not immune to needing guidance and wisdom in my own life. It's been a rough 18 months. And I've got my friend Ed on the other line today because that's what he does for me. He speaks life to me, and that's precisely what I need right now. I think you might need it too. I know my life isn't the only difficult one. I'm not the only one feeling like I'm banging my head against the freaking wall in a no-win situation with no-win conversations day after day. My hope today is that my friend Ed will also give us some hope and help us to see maybe an aggressive move that you can do in being honest about where you are and asking for help. Dr. Ed Stetzer is a professor and dean at Wheaton College, where he serves as executive director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. He's planted, revitalized, and coached churches and pastors on 6 continents. He's earned more degrees and doctorates than you can shake a stick at. He's authored hundreds of articles and a dozen books. Ed is frequently sought out to speak on the church and Christianity and was recently featured on the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast. Welcome to The Aggressive Life, Ed Stetzer.
Wow. That is aggressive life right there.
That is, it's all about pushing people. And today I want to push people a little bit in the, religious area, the spiritual area. This is not a i.e. religious podcast, spiritual podcast, but certainly my day job is a pastor.
I think people might know you as a pastor. That's true.
Some people might.
Yeah.
And you're kind of the guru of evangelicalism.
That's what I was going for.
Yeah, I know. What define right now? So people would wonder, what is an evangelical exactly, according to you?
Well, first of all, that's a great question. I'm actually writing a whole book on that very question. So evangelical tends to be somebody who holds a very high view of the Bible, holds someone who believes that men and women need to receive by grace and through faith the good news of the gospel, receive Christ and more. They tend to have a desire to share that faith, and they tend to focus their faith on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So an evangelical would be someone like you and someone like me who believes those things.
Really, that's it? Because it seems like evangelicalism is a lot more than that.
Yeah, well, let's not talk about that. Let's just focus on what it should be, not what it actually is. No, you're right. I mean, that's the challenge right now. So there's so many other things that are tied up in it. So people hear evangelical, and they think that's a subblock of the Republican Party. If you're a white evangelical, people hear evangelical, they may hear judgmental or super religious or something to that effect. But it's supposed to be, and scholars define it by, I know it's not a phrase that we use around the house, but the Bebington quadrilateral. Those 4 things I listed are the 4 things in the Bebington quadrilateral that kind of makes I know, don't make fun of the Bebington quadrilateral.
No, I know, this is fascinating. Okay. The Bebington quadrilateral.
Yes.
Who is Bebington, and when did he lose all of the function of his limbs?
Yeah, wow. Okay, I'm not how to respond to that, but I'm just going to move through. So quadrilateral, 4 things that make up the definition. And Bebington is a British historian who was writing, and he's a scholar. So the job of scholars is to come up with definitions. Matter of fact, a lot of education is just simply the defining of words. And so Bebington comes up with these 4 things, and most people, that's kind of what it looks like, is that you'd want to see, as an evangelical, I mean, you and I are both concerned that women and men, young people might hear the good news and respond by grace and through faith to the good news of the gospel and be what Jesus called being born again. So not everyone believes that. Not everyone who uses the name Christian to describe or define themselves believes that. So we're kind of a subset of the broad Christian tradition that believes those things. Specifically, Bebington says biblicism, crucicentrism, which just means, biblicism, centrality of the Bible, crucicentrism, centrality of the cross, crucifix, right? Conversionism, which is what I've already mentioned a couple times, men and women being born again, trusting and follow Jesus, and then activism. The gospel is spread, and also we live out its implications through effort. Your church there, doing these wonderful things in racial reconciliation. Well, why do you do those things? I mean, because you do this because you're followers of Jesus, and this is the kind of activism that you feel God has called you to.
Let me go on the counselor couch before you right now.
Yes.
And just share with you my life over the last 18 months. And I want you to speak into it as to what this means about evangelicalism, the state of the church, what's going on. Because I've heard you talk about some things recently, which is why I wanted to have you on. You really got your pulse on a bunch of things that are happening. So let me just process with you, and then you tell me, like, what's the thing under the thing, okay?
Yeah.
So COVID has just kicked my ass upside down, one side, the other. It's just been tough. It's wonderful to be able to say that word on my podcast.
Yeah, it's your podcast, not mine. You can't say it on my podcast. Well, actually, anyway.
I won't say it on your podcast, but it's Aggressive Life. So I'm talking on this like I would with somebody if I'm having a beer with them.
Yeah.
COVID started off like there was a jolt of leadership firepower.
Right,
like, okay, we always knew the church wasn't about buildings.
Yep.
Here we go. Let's make that
unite together. Let's make a difference. Yep.
Right, exactly. And it was really fun. It was something different. And then it started to get really just boring and just really, really old. And then all of the racial stuff went to a whole new level. Then coming out of that, you've got all kind of stuff politically. I thought Crossroads was a political free zone, that we were apolitical. I used to wear that on my sleeve. But then we're getting crushed for that because we say things that people read into, or we're not saying something that people want to hear about. And then we have an outside speaker comes in and we talk about transgender stuff, which was a huge mistake. I shouldn't have had an outside speaker come in. I should have been the first one to talk about it. It didn't go really, really well. And people just were hyper upset that we talked about that topic. And then we apologized that we didn't make it clear that we love people who are in the LGBTQIA plus community, and I should have handled it differently. And then we had just many people upset that we apologized for it. Yeah. And then I have the audacity to say that I got vaccinated. I think it's a good idea. You might want to think about it. And oh my gosh, people just come unglued. You shouldn't be using that. Why don't I come to church to hear about vaccines? And Ed, I feel like I can't do right. Yeah. I can't. It used to be I felt like I couldn't do wrong. Now today, I feel like I can't do right. What's going on? I know there's something. I know I'm not just failing as a leader. I feel that very, very much. I know I'm not just failing, but there's something else going on culturally. What's going on?
Yeah. I think we're in the midst of a cultural convulsion, and David Brooks wrote an article about this. I think he called it a moral convulsion. I wanted to broaden it to a cultural convulsion. Brooks is a new follower of Jesus, New York Times columnist. I think he wrote this in the Atlantic. And yeah, I mean, 2020, 2021 wasn't just about COVID, though that should have been enough. Remember, we had 2 impeachments. We had mass political division, an election, a contested election, a January 6th riot, the murder of George Floyd, summer riots that followed. And people are actually keeping track of what you said and didn't say. So let's say you mentioned the murder of George Floyd, and you didn't mention the summer riots, but then you did mention, again, maybe the January 6th riots. People are like, well, wait, you must be this now. So they're kind of putting you in categories and saying, well, I demand that you speak up more on this or that.
Exactly.
And if you didn't mention the murder of George Floyd, people were holding signs saying, say his name. So if you didn't mention the murder of George Floyd, then you're not willing to take specific stands on specific injustices and more. So what's happened is this is perhaps the most difficult time for pastors and church leaders, but it's not the first time. I should finish my sentence. The most difficult time in our lifetime. And I don't remember where we were. You and I were having dinner together somewhere with some group, and it was just such a simpler time. But it's not like that anymore.
We were talking about simple things like, should churches be huge and massive, or should they be smaller?
Yeah, exactly.
Those are nice discussions.
Those are nice. I miss those discussions. Let's go back to those.
Yeah.
So what's happening is a cultural convulsion, which appears every 60 years. Now, you and I are not old enough to remember the 60s personally, but we might look historically. So think about 1968, right? 1968 Vietnam War protests, civil rights protests. Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated that year. Today, by the way, he's almost universally affirmed, but back then, low 20s approval rating. People calling him, and anyone who supported him, a communist and more. And all this is Bobby Kennedy assassinated that year. Riots all over the place, including riots in Chicago that was later, the report said it was a police riot. The Mayor Daley said, just go break open all their heads, and the cops did. So we have all this complexity. And what a lot of people forget, Brian, is that was also the year of a global pandemic. H3N2, and our grandparents would have called it the Hong Kong flu. And instead of shutting everything down, they actually started planning Woodstock. So their approach was a little different back then as far as how to handle things. So, but if you were a pastor in 1968, man, you felt the angst. People were saying, are you going to speak up on civil rights? If you didn't speak up on civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a book, Letters from a Birmingham Jail, towards white pastors who didn't speak up on civil rights. So there's this push and this pull going on that is similar to what we are feeling now. Now, pastors are in the middle of it because, they're not the only ones, but they're in the middle of it because they have people who are, you're a multicultural church. You're known for your robust and important conversations around racial justice and racial reconciliation. But if you spoke up about the murder of George Floyd, which, police officers everywhere would say this is not what it's. This was widely, Republicans and Democrats all said this is horrible, this is wrong. But then it got politicized later, and people began to say, well, does that mean you don't support the police? My brother is the highest-ranking law enforcement in Western North Carolina with the federal government. My uncle, New York City cop, my grandfather, fire battalion chief, New York City. These are, of course, we come from a law enforcement family. But it's hard now to both be concerned about racial justice and reconciliation and be someone who cares about violence being restrained in our communities and supports the good work of so many good police officers. So all of a sudden, this has all come crashing down. It's a cultural convulsion. Now, you asked, what's next? Well, we don't know, but here's what we see in past cultural convulsions. Go back to the early 1900s, the 60s. It's not a 1 or 2 year deal. It tends to be 3, 4, 5 years. So I think, what I'm telling pastors, it's not a pastor podcast, what I'm telling pastors is, man, you got to build some reservoirs of resilience for the next few years. If I used to say, pastors leading, I said, man, if 5% of your church isn't mad at you, you probably had 5% of your church mad at you all the time for the last 20 years. If 5% of your church isn't mad at you, you're probably not doing anything substantial in leadership. But man, and I would tell them back in the day, before 2020, I would say, but if 70% of your church is mad at you, you might want to slow down and bring the people along with you. Well, if 25 or 30% of your people aren't mad at you, you're probably just not in the midst of the normal tug of war that's going on right now in our culture. So no, I think you're rightly reading the Times. I don't
really 30%.
I'm making that number up. So it's
all right, but that's encouraging.
Yeah, no, I think so. So I was talking to, I preached out at a church called, that some of your listeners may not be familiar with, but it's called Saddleback in Southern California. And I was talking to the pastor, his name's Rick Warren, his wife's Kay Warren, and we were talking. And it's like, they're trying to deal with all this stuff, Southern California, a lot of rules. But they're talking about how many people have left unhappy with, he pastored them for 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
And when you told people they got to wear masks, you're a compromised coward. When you told people that masks were recommended, not required, well, you don't care about people. You must think you want everyone to die of COVID, and it's just coming at you constantly. And it's a remarkably difficult time to lead in 2021, and I don't think it's going away for 2-3 more years. Sorry.
So what do I do? Because part of me says, well, do I and other pastors, do we just go in a corner and play rope-a-dope and let's just teach the right theology and all that stuff? Or do we speak into things?
Yeah.
This is called the Aggressive Life Podcast. Part of why I've gotten in this trouble we have is we've chosen to speak to certain things. I don't know, man. Do you speak into certain things, or you just say, forget it, we're just going to do our verse-by-verse Bible study and never mention anything anywhere?
Yeah. Well, I think, let me just say on verse-by-verse Bible study. So, I'm the interim teaching pastor of a church in New York City. Maybe for a little while longer. They have a pastor coming next week in view of a call. But on the Sunday after 9/11, this is in New York City, right? So this church is on West 57th Street across from Carnegie Hall. I'm preaching through the book of Matthew, and we come up on the verse, to pray for your enemies and love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And, so sometimes even verse by verse, the Sunday, the 20th, after the 20th anniversary of 9/11, you preach on that. But what I would say too is, it's important too because you have a national global platform. I'm a cultural commentator, so I will say things that I encourage pastors and church leaders not to say. So, I write specifically on public policy on issues. I'm pro-life, right? I'm pro-religious liberty. I'm pro-racial reconciliation. I'm pro-refugee. And which maddens people because those four things aren't supposed to track together, and yet I think it matters that they do. So, as a cultural commentator, I would say more than most pastors would. But what I would say is, I think it's I do think there are things in our culture that people need to hear that pastors are, I think after the murder of George Floyd, I think it was appropriate to say we grieve with the members of our African American community who saw and were deeply wounded, and we join with them in calling for justice in the case of George Floyd. And we want to live in a world where they're not wondering if their lives indeed do matter. I think it's good to say that. But I'm not sure that that's an every week thing, right? I think, I joined faith pastors. James Meeks is the pastor of one of the largest black churches in Chicago, and he's a student at our program at Wheaton College Graduate School, and he's on the board of Moody Bible Institute. He texts me and says, "Would you come down and join the Faith Leaders March?" And I'm like, "Of course I will." And we marched against injustice. We also stood at the place where a drugstore had been looted during the riots, and the high-rises, predominantly African-American senior adult housing, they could now get the medication they needed to survive because of the injustice brought about by rioting. So I would say that it is good to weigh in with a biblical perspective. Not here's my opinion, with a biblical perspective. And it gets tricky. After the election, my phone lit up by pastors asking me, by I think it was Friday, Fox News called, and I think all the major networks called the election for now President Biden. And my phone lit up. People say, "Do I pray for President-elect Biden now this Sunday?" Well, if you did, people noticed because some people still were saying the election wasn't fair and more. So I would say you got to sort of balance out. Where do you want to spend your capital, your influence? And I would say you have very much done so. You've spent on issues of racial reconciliation. But I would also mention, you talked about sexuality earlier. I think that's a conversation everyone's talking about. I think that's an appropriate conversation. I appreciate what you're saying. You maybe should have done that message. But what I would say is that's an appropriate conversation for us to have. People want to know, what does the Bible teach about these issues? And, how might we, address, issues of gender identity? Gender dysphoria is a real thing. What does it mean as a follower of Jesus who struggles with gender dysphoria? What does it mean as the church to uphold biblical truth and to care for people who are struggling? So yeah, I would say, like your series where you kind of went into these, this is the Aggressive Life podcast, right? Well, you went at those things, and one of them blew up. But you know what? I'm just glad you were willing to have these conversations, because a lot of people are hiding from these conversations. Again, I don't think pastors should be cultural commentators. I don't think every week should be this issue to that issue, that issue. But the major issues of the day that have biblical bearing. Now, here's the thing. I've read the Bible cover to cover multiple times. I've never seen Jesus mentioned his preferred marginal tax rate for the U.S. system. So I don't get up and talk about, I think we need higher or lower taxes, because I don't think that's something. But when it comes to racial reconciliation, how we speak of immigrants and refugees, it's called life in the womb, these are all things that are biblical teachings. Yeah. So you bet I'm going to talk about those.
I think that part of the reason why everything is so contentious right now isn't just that the church mirrors culture too much, because all of culture is contentious. I also think that everybody is more worn out and more bruised than they give themselves credit for. I heard a statistic the other day, and I can't verify it, so I'm not even going to verify the statistic or tell you where it came from. But I think it's a great conversation start-off point. It was from somebody who worked in data collection, one of the big boys and all that stuff, and it said, based on what we see with all that's happening online, a sizable percentage of the American population, by the standards of 5 years ago, would be institutionalized. because we're just on the edge.
Yeah.
People are worn out. I see it in people's eyes. I see bags. I met with a guy recently who was leaving our church. It was a real rough one to see, and I hadn't seen him for a year and a half. I looked at this guy, and he was like, wow, he is not who he was a year and a half ago.
True.
Are you seeing that, or do you have any reaction to that? What that says about just our own personal health as Americans?
Yes, no, absolutely. So, for me, I've been a big advocate for mental health. I've been a big advocate for people seeking treatment and more. And part of it has to do with a family story that I've written in other places. Don't have time to unpack here. But at the beginning of COVID, we at the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, we were all in. We were launching coronavirusinthechurch.com. We were helping churches. People were using our resources. We actually, through our partnerships, had 10,000 churches go through mentoring partnerships we were working with. And our whole team, some of whom are right here while I'm recording this, they're working 12, 14-hour days. And, at the same time, I got three daughters. They got 3 daughters. And, one's, high school graduation's canceled. All these things are the other college shuts down and all her friends are gone. And, Donna's an introvert. I'm an extrovert. So after President Trump, announced the 2-week shutdown and then he extended it to 4 weeks, I said to her, because I'm a big extrovert, I said to her, so, 4 more weeks in lockdown, as an introvert, is this a good thing for you? Do you like us being, kind of like, and her response to me, she smiled and said, are you going to be here the whole time? Because it was all this stress for all of us sort of experiencing. And then a friend of mine died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It made national news. Darren Patrick was his name. And I wept for Amy. I wept for his kids. And for me, it was a point where I had nothing left. And I actually been experiencing this low-level anxiety. For the first time I go to my doctor, I say, listen, I just said to him, I'm a big advocate. I'm now experiencing this anxiety that has been here for weeks, months now. And he advised some dieting changes, and I lost a lot of weight, started exercising. But the reality is, man, I think people really are struggling emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. And I think that's normal. That's probably saying that, hopefully, for people listening to the podcast, that's freeing for them. I mean, you were saying you were asking rhetorically, am I a bad leader? I think that's what a lot of pastors are asking. Am I a bad leader? And they're asking also, am I going through some sort of personal crisis? And I think we're going through a global crisis. So, and people even talking about this, people are like, well, you should have made COVID such a big deal. Everyone's got an opinion about everything. And I want to quote that famous theologian Taylor Swift, you need to calm down about every opinion that you have, right? But I do think it's a real crisis. And as pastors and leaders, you and I are working with a lot of people, as pastors and leaders, think about quitting the ministry, and people in churches who are divided. And I would just say, too, if you're being discipled by your cable news and you're being spiritually shaped by your social media, and then you come to Crossroads or High Point where I am or Calvary where I serve as interim, and you expect your pastor to align ideologically rather than theologically. Well, that tells me that you're being shaped more by your cable news than the gospel and the scriptures. And I think ultimately my job is not to be the advocate for everything you've seen on cable news or on social media. My job is to teach the word of God, to speak up for issues when there's brokenness and wrongness and to do so in a godly, Christ-honoring way. But boy, we've never seen a time like this before, and I think we're here 2 or 3 more years to walk through it. We'll see.
Dude, theological alignment instead of ideological alignment. Wow, that's strong. Yeah. All right, man, dude, I could go so deep with you. I'll just ask you one more because I know you're on a tight time frame. It's a big one. The church is not short of scandals these days. Yep. You got Willow Creek that's still licking its wounds, and all that happened with Bill Hybels, who was a driving force in evangelicalism. You've got Hillsong, which was everybody's favorite band and everything. Now it's like every news channel's latest scandal with financial stuff or impropriety, whatever, bad stuff there. You got the hottest podcast, which is a phenomenal podcast, Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, just how it's produced and everything, that kind of makes all of us meaning men who have larger churches, suspect. Yeah. At least I feel that. I feel that about it. Is this the death knell of the church as we know it in America, or at least the church that has any size to it at all?
No. I mean, again, this has been the death of the large church has been predicted for as long as I have been pastor and leading. Same thing for you. We've heard this over and over again that this is it. This is the end. And I know
Right.
is the answer to your question. I think where most people, when they go to the church you serve, they connect with the people there, and they see their struggles and their imperfections, and they acknowledge those things are real. But most people. Suspicion grows when we see national scandals, but they still are engaging with their neighbor. And so what I would say is I think it does. You specifically mentioned larger churches. You're pastoring one of the largest churches in the country. What I would say to pastors and leaders who are pastoring in some largest churches, I have a gathering of the pastors of some of the largest churches in the country. We had a conversation this summer at a private gathering of those pastors, and my exhortation to them was get in better accountability, deal with your own emotional and spiritual health. It's a good thing to deal with your own emotional and spiritual health. Have a group of elders. If your elders never tell you no, you don't have elders, you have cheerleaders, because all they're doing is cheering you on. They're not eldering in the process. So I think there are lessons to be learned, and we should learn those lessons. The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, Mike Cosper is... it's interesting. Just so I've been quoted in several of the episodes, and in doing so, every time I don't know when I'm going to get quoted. I listen to an episode and it's there, and I'm like, oh, because I feel like it's also in Christian faith we talk about a prophetic reminder, something it speaks prophetically to me. So every time I listen to another episode, or even I hear myself on that episode, I think I've got to make sure I guard my own heart as well. And so I think, we want to be careful not to say there but the grace of God go I with something like Ravi Zacharias. That's not there but the grace of God go I. There was just a level of evil and hiding there that's quite stunning. But my heart, too, needs to be guarded and watched. And so what I would say to you, to me, to other Christian leaders, let's hear the prophetic rebuke that comes from these falls and say, how do I guard my heart? How do I guard my relationships? How do I not start being that person that I don't want to be? And I've seen it. You've seen it. Sometimes we can become the person we don't want to be. And how do we do that? I think it has to do with relationships, accountability, walk with the Lord, and more. So that's, but as far as statistically, the number of megachurches in the United States doubles every 10 years. And there's no sign that trend is slowing. At the beginning of COVID, people, it's the end of the large church. It's not the end of the large church. It certainly has some substantive impact on gathering, but people seem to be drawn to large churches. Let's make sure those large churches don't become all about you or all about me or all about the machine and the system, but they become about God's glory, our good, and the good of others in our community as well.
People are predicting the demise of the quote-unquote attractional church, the mega church. You're exactly right. For literally decades. And you're right. Churches just keep getting bigger and bigger, and there keeps getting more and more of them. And I think the bigger question is, how are we doing on health? Where's that going? Yeah. And I think you're putting your finger on something, and we got to stop playing the whole church wars, the church size wars, and it's about the heart. And unfortunately, we've got some broken hearts in Christendom, or we wouldn't keep having these problems we got.
I agree. And I think ultimately, the last few years have revealed some real problems in our movement. We started talking about what evangelicalism is. I wish it was just those four things at the Bevington Quadrilateral, but there's a lot of issues. There's issues of unhealthy relationships, lack of accountability. There's issues of how we treat one another, issues of how we treat one another, men and women and people of different races and ethnicities. And what I would say is, evangelicalism's not dying or even declining by most measures substantively. Large churches are certainly not declining. They're growing. My concern is not whether we're declining, but I do want to be careful of what we're becoming. Let's make sure that we are being shaped by the scriptures, by the kind of life that Jesus calls us to. And if that's the case, I think we'll learn from this current season of scandal, and instead it'll draw us closer to the Lord.
Well, the scary thing is, for me and for others, is as there's been more churches and more huge churches, that doesn't mean there's more believers in Christ in culture. there's not more believers in Christ in culture. I don't think so. There's probably less or the same, whatever it is. They're amassed in fewer churches that are larger. So if I was an evil one who was trying to take down the work of God, my job's a little bit easier because I got fewer targets now. Because if I could take down that guy or that organization, now I've just messed with the faith of tens of thousands of people versus taking down some guy who's a great guy but is pastoring 150 people and you got a bunch of churches that are that size. So I think the stakes of the game are higher, and I just think we're in perilous times. And I'm not encouraged that you're saying we're in for 2 to 3 more years of this.
Sorry.
No,
maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe I'll be wrong.
Well, but if there is an end date, if I could say, all right, it's that actually is encouraging for that. So you got any other closing thoughts for us? We've already gone over your time. Anything else you want to talk about that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I would encourage people who listen to the podcast, your audience is not pastors and church leaders, that in the midst of 1968, all this stuff took place. It was a crazy, tumultuous time. It was actually more divided than today. Millions of people, Vietnam War protests, civil rights movement, and more. And churches were divided, people were divided, and there was a guy named Chuck Smith who asked his daughter to bring home a hippie, brought home a guy named Lonnie Frisbee, and they started a Bible study at this place called Calvary Chapel, and 20 to 30 million people kind of traced their spiritual heritage to how God moved in that very broken time. And what I would just say is if you're feeling that, in the midst of your own life and your own brokenness, draw near to the Lord. If you don't know the Lord, it's an opportunity for you to receive by grace and through faith the good news of the gospel. If you do know the Lord, it's an opportunity to trust Him that He's going to work even in the midst of a tumultuous and turbulent time.
Well said, Ed Stetzer. Some good words for us. Hey, I hope we pushed you here today. Maybe this is just aggressive in that you opened yourself up to an industry, not that the church is an industry, but a segment of America that you're not all that familiar with. Hey, whatever you are, whatever organization you're in, whatever business you're in, whatever your walk of life in, it's tough out there right now. It is. Hey, man up, woman up, put your big person panties on and live your life. Take control of your life. Don't just be a victim. Go forward. That's the aggressive life. Hey, thanks for listening. For all things aggressive living, why don't you head over to briantome.com. Find my new book, Move, a guide to get up and go forward, as well as articles and much, much more. And no matter where you listen to podcasts, why don't you take a second and leave us a rating, leave us a review. It really, really helps us drive new listeners to the show. We want to help as many people as possible, just like we may have helped you. We want to help others. So why don't you help us out? And if you want to connect, find me on Instagram at Brian Tome. The Aggressive Life with Brian Tome is a production of Crossroads Church, Cincinnati, Ohio.